What does the United States have in common with Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and China? The answer is death penalty. According to the United Nations, these countries are responsible for 82% of death penalty executions. A common defense for the death penalty is that it deters crime. But in 2007, states that had the death penalty actually had murder rates up to 42% higher than states that had abolished the death penalty. We should realize the seriousness of violent crime in our society, but we should also realize the profound punishment that is death penalty is not a viable solution and does not deter other murderers or crimes from happening. In this speech, I will discuss the methods of execution, the racial biases of death penalty, its inability to prevent crime, as well as looking towards another country who has successfully abolished death penalty and reformed prison sentencing. Methods of state execution have varied, but whether it's death by hanging, firing squad, or the electric chair, which recently has become less popular due to the violent appearance of the corpse, or other more modern methods like lethal injection or lethal gas, in the end, the results are the same. Would you accept the death penalty for a murderer? Probably. A rapist? How about a drug dealer? All these criminals may face the death penalty, but is it an appropriate form of justice? When it comes to capital punishment, the process of selecting a jury is literally a matter of life or death. It is reasonable to ask whether state Supreme Courts are acting impartially or being swayed by public opinion. In the 1990s, public support for capital punishment reached an all-time high, polling as high as 80% in favor. Could a state Supreme Court judge ignore this when faced with a capital appeal? Statistics suggest that false convictions are not that rare. The National Academy of Science shows that 4% of inmates currently on death row may actually be innocent. There is no way to tell how many of the 1,518 people executed since 1976 may have also been innocent. Courts generally do not entertain claims of innocence when the defendant is dead. Defense attorneys move on to other cases where the client's lives can still be saved. But the rate of erroneous conviction of innocent criminal defendants is usually described as not just being unknown, but unknowable. There's no method to determine the accuracy of a criminal conviction, and if there were, these errors wouldn't happen in the first place. As a result, very few false convictions are ever actually discovered, and those that are not representative of the group as a whole. Like I said earlier, it's impossible to know the true number of people on death row who may be innocent, but let's take a look at some cases that had strong evidence of a wrongful conviction and execution. A two-part investigative series by the Houston Chronicle cast doubt on the guilt of a Texas man who was executed in 1993, Reuben Cantu, who persistently proclaimed his innocence and was only 17 when charged with capital murder of the shooting death of a San Antonio man during an attempted robbery. Now, the prosecutor, the jury forewoman, both expressed doubts about the case. Moreover, both the key eyewitness in the state's case against Cantu and Cantu's co-defendant have come forward to say that Texas executed an innocent man. There's a lot more political pressure as of late to abolish the death penalty. It's hit a record low of public support according to a recent Gallup poll taken in June of 2020, which states that 54% of people today are in favor of death penalty compared to 80% just 30 years ago. The Constitution has an amendment that bans cruel and unusual punishment. Although today, through its current interpretation, this is not applicable to the death penalty, this can still change, and there is still a contentious debate on the matter. Currently, half the states in the nation have the death penalty, while 22% have no death penalty, and the other 3 have governor-imposed moratoriums. Most of the states that have abolished the death penalty have done so in the last 20 years, which makes it seem like abolition is the trend of the future. Death penalty is not only ineffective, but a more costly measure than life in prison by any metric. Death penalty costs nearly 3 times as much as a life sentence. There is also an inherent racial bias in the death penalty. 43% of people on death row are minorities. While white people account for half of all homicides, 80% of capital punishment cases involve white victims. George Steiny, for example, was a 14-year-old African-American boy who was convicted and sentenced to the electric chair in 1944 in South Carolina, accused of murdering 2 white girls aged 7 and 11. The proceeding was later vacated by the state, and they admitted that they made a huge mistake. Even globally now, though, it seems that death penalty is on its way out. Information pulled from the Death Penalty Information Center shows that 142 countries have totally abolished death penalty in law or practice, while 56 countries still retain the practice of capital punishment in some form for just specific cases or just in general for criminals. Some countries have also taken a different stance in criminal justice. Recidivism rates, or the rates of repeat offending, is often used as a measure of effectiveness of prison systems and post-release offender management programs. The comparison of these recidivism rates between countries and regions provides useful information about relative effectiveness of different sentencing and rehabilitation policies. The United States, for example, has the highest recidivism rate at 76%. Comparatively, Norway, a country well known for its penal rehabilitation policies and restorative justice, has a rate of just 20%. Norway, however, is a little bit different, but they only incarcerate, for example, people at a rate of 75 per 100,000, while the U.S. does 707 incarcerations per 100,000 people. Norway also has a lower crime rate in comparison to the U.S. Fewer Norway citizens go to prison, and usually when they do, they only go once. Based on this information, it's safe to say Norway is actually doing something good. Norway's prisons are known to be very liberal in comparison to the United States, and through these practices of restorative justice, they allow prisoners who are, in prison to be prepared for life outside with vocational programs and, a more loose environment rather than the strict punishment in U.S. prisons, which actually, according to a 2007 report released by the U.S. Department of Justice, actually increases recidivism. When thinking of law, there are examples in the past where laws that were legal, things that were legal, were highly immoral. I think we can say that death penalty is a legally immoral law. When addressing capital punishment, it is imperative to ask yourself, is this really a proper form of justice? The facts are death penalty does not deter crime, has gotten innocent people killed, is racially biased, and costs more than a life sentence, and arguably is unconstitutional as well. As Americans, we need to ask ourselves how we approach crime and how we treat our criminals, and put pressure on our governors who can do something to end death penalty. Effective rehabilitation of criminals requires an appreciation of just how different people are. Anyone who has taught a group of students, no matter their material or the students in the class, had to grapple with varying learning styles and capabilities. Teaching a criminal how to desist from crime upon release of prison shares many of the same principles, and someday soon we can live in an America that will abolish the death penalty and focus on rehabilitating criminals. So when they go to jail, they won't be making repeated visits. Thank you.